When you think of medieval warfare, the mind usually jumps to swords clashing, knights in gleaming armor, and the thunder of horses charging across muddy fields. But for many who lived through the wars of the Middle Ages, the real story did not end on the battlefield. Instead, it often continued in quieter, far more drawn-out settings, the prisons, towers, and makeshift holding chambers where captives were kept. For a knight, noble, or even a wealthy merchant, capture was not always the end of life. In fact, in many cases, it was just the beginning of a long, uncertain wait. Medieval warfare operated under a system where ransom payments were a key part of the process. A captured nobleman was not necessarily doomed to death. Instead, he might find himself waiting, sometimes for years, while his family, overlords, or local community scraped together enough coin to secure his release. But what happened if the money never came? To understand this, you first need to picture what captivity meant in the Middle Ages. Unlike the neat, uniform prisons of today, medieval imprisonment varied widely depending on location, status, and the captor's resources. Some prisoners were kept in castles, stone chambers with barred windows and thick wooden doors, often drafty and damp. Others might be locked in town jails or makeshift wooden stockades. For high-value prisoners, like important nobles, conditions could actually be surprisingly comfortable. A wealthy baron might find himself lodged in a chamber within his captor's castle, allowed servants, food, and even books to pass the time, since it was in the captor's best interest to keep him alive and in decent health until ransom could be negotiated. But for lesser prisoners, soldiers, minor officials, or those of uncertain wealth, the experience was far harsher. Many were kept in cold underground cells, chained to walls or floors, with only meager food provided. The captor had little incentive to treat them kindly if no ransom seemed likely. Instead, they were reduced to living in conditions that blurred the line between punishment and neglect. The length of captivity varied enormously. Negotiating ransom was a process filled with complications. Families had to be contacted, contracts drawn up, and payments delivered. The church sometimes intervened to set fair ransom amounts, and local laws could limit excessive demands. Yet, even with these structures, the system was fragile. Imagine, for instance, that you are a captured knight whose family estate has been devastated by war. Your relatives may not have the wealth to free you, and so you wait, hoping circumstances change. Waiting became its own kind of punishment. Prisoners marked time not in days but in seasons, watching the year pass through narrow slits of light from their cells. In some cases, captives carved tally marks into stone walls, leaving behind faint records of months that stretched into years. Food might come once or twice a day, often bread and broth, brought in wooden bowls by guards who rarely spoke more than a few words. Still, captivity was not entirely static. Prisoners could sometimes write letters, appealing to relatives or patrons for help. These letters often carried a tone of desperation, carefully phrased so as not to offend but urgent in their request for funds. For those of noble rank, correspondence became a lifeline, a fragile connection to the world beyond stone walls. It is important to remember that imprisonment was not only about physical containment, it was about uncertainty. Unlike a modern sentence, where a prisoner knows the length of time to serve, medieval captives often had no idea how long their confinement would last. A man might be freed in weeks, months, or never at all. That uncertainty weighed heavily on the mind. Chronicles from the period mention men who fell into melancholy, their spirits broken by endless waiting. Even the physical spaces of captivity reflected this uncertainty. In some castles, there were dungeons deep underground, where prisoners sat in near darkness, the air heavy with dampness and the smell of mold. In others, captives were placed in towers, where they could see the world outside but not touch it. The sight of passing villagers, fields changing color with the seasons, or birds wheeling in the sky must have been both comforting and cruel. Not all imprisonment was solitary. Captives were often kept together, sometimes crowded in small spaces. In such conditions, the noise of coughing, snoring, or whispered conversations filled the nights. Bonds might form among fellow prisoners, alliances of survival, though such bonds were fragile. Everyone knew that if a ransom was ever raised, one man might leave while the rest remained. That unevenness, where some were freed and others forgotten, added bitterness to captivity. Daily routines, if one can call them that, were monotonous. Morning brought food, usually simple and repetitive. Some prisoners might be allowed limited movement, perhaps within a courtyard, while others were confined entirely. In wealthier prisons, guards allowed games like dice or chess to pass the time. In poorer ones, boredom reigned supreme. Prisoners told and retold the same stories, recited prayers, or counted bricks in the walls. The body weakened under such conditions. Malnutrition was common, as rations were rarely generous. Illness could sweep through crowded cells, with no physician to tend to the sick. In some regions, particularly during outbreaks of plague, captors worried that prisoners might spread disease, leading to harsher isolation or, in the worst cases, abandonment. For some, captivity was not even meant to end with ransom. While noble captives had some hope, lesser prisoners might simply be left to languish. Local lords had no financial incentive to release poor soldiers, and executions, though less common than one might expect, did occur. However, the greater punishment was often neglect, the slow wasting away of men who were not worth the effort of freeing. And so, the story of medieval prisoners is not one of sudden violence, but of long, drawn-out waiting. A waiting that tested not only the body but the soul. Yet this raises a question: what happened to those whose ransom never arrived, whose families could not or would not pay? When we left off, the question lingered: what happened to prisoners whose families could not raise the money for their release? To answer this, we need to look more closely at the system of ransom itself, and how it became both a lifeline and a trap for medieval captives. Ransom in the Middle Ages was not simply a financial matter, it was a deeply cultural practice. It emerged from a world where warfare was shaped as much by honor and status as by violence. To capture an enemy alive, especially one of high rank, was considered more useful than killing him outright. Killing might bring glory, but capture brought profit. The captor could demand a ransom, essentially a fee for the prisoner's safe return, and in doing so, turned war into a form of negotiation. But the system worked unevenly. For wealthy nobles, a ransom was achievable, even if difficult. Families would sell land, pledge estates, or borrow heavily from financiers to meet the demand. Entire communities sometimes contributed, knowing that the release of their lord was tied to their own stability. For ordinary men, however, the ransom system was merciless. A common soldier rarely commanded enough wealth to make his freedom worthwhile. Captors might demand a small sum, but even that could be beyond the reach of a poor family. Imagine a farmer whose son had been conscripted into war. The family barely had enough grain to survive the winter, let alone pay silver coins for his return. In such cases, the prisoner's fate hung in limbo. The process of setting ransom was complex. Negotiations often took months, even years. Captors wanted as much money as possible. But excessive demands risked leaving the prisoner unclaimed forever. To balance this, customary rules developed. The Church, in particular, tried to regulate ransom, insisting that sums should not be ruinous. Councils issued decrees that ransom must be reasonable, though what counted as reasonable varied widely. For high-ranking captives, documentation was key. Contracts, called letters of ransom, were drawn up, detailing the agreed amount, the deadline for payment, and the guarantees of good faith. These documents were sealed with wax and carried across borders, ensuring that both sides had legal proof of the bargain. If the prisoner was released before full payment, hostages, often relatives or retainers, were given as security. These hostages themselves risked long captivity if the ransom was not delivered. But such structured negotiations rarely applied to lesser prisoners. For them, release might hinge on an informal promise or a desperate plea. A captor might accept whatever money the family could scrape together, or, if no payment seemed forthcoming, might simply abandon the prisoner's care. The result was a spectrum of fates. Some men returned home quickly, others waited in cells for years, and many simply vanished from the record, their lives consumed by imprisonment. The burden of ransom extended beyond money, it reshaped entire households. Families of captured men faced agonizing choices. To pay the ransom, they might need to sell valuable land, livestock, or heirlooms. Women bore much of this burden, managing estates in their husband's absence and negotiating with creditors. In some cases, wives traveled across regions to plead for help from allies or relatives. Chroniclers tell of noblewomen who worked tirelessly to raise funds, writing letters and organizing sales, their daily lives consumed by the effort. For communities, too, ransom could be devastating. When a prominent local leader was captured, towns sometimes imposed collective taxes to raise the necessary sum. Villagers and merchants alike were expected to contribute, whether they wished to or not. Failure to free the leader could weaken local defense, disrupt trade, or invite rival lords to seize power. Thus, ransom became not only a personal matter but a communal crisis. What about those who could not pay? Here, the paths diverged. Some prisoners remained in captivity indefinitely. Their names faded from chronicles, but their presence lingered in castles and dungeons, silent reminders of debts unpaid. Others found themselves pressed into service. Instead of money, captors sometimes accepted labor as ransom. Prisoners might be forced to work on estates, serve as soldiers under their captor's banner, or perform menial tasks within the castle. Such service could last years, effectively turning ransom into indentured servitude. In rare cases, prisoners escaped. Tales of daring escapes, though often embellished, do appear in medieval chronicles. A man might bribe a guard, dig through a wall, or disguise himself to slip past sentries. Yet escape was perilous. If caught, punishment could be severe: chains, harsher confinement, or even execution. Successful escapes were exceptions rather than the rule. Most prisoners lacked the means, opportunity, or strength to attempt such feats. The question of ransom also reveals a broader truth about medieval society: freedom was never guaranteed. A man's worth was measured in coin, and if no one could or would pay, his life narrowed to the confines of captivity. For the wealthy, ransom was a temporary burden. For the poor, it was a wall without a door. The psychological toll of waiting for ransom was immense. Letters from captives that survive to this day often carry a tone of despair. One knight wrote of the bitterness of delay, pleading with his family not to forget him. Another prisoner begged for just a little silver, knowing that even a small contribution might ease negotiations. These voices remind us that beyond the financial system lay real human suffering, men who wondered daily if they had been abandoned. And yet, not every story ended in hopelessness. Sometimes, unexpected patrons intervened. A wealthy relative, a sympathetic lord, or even a religious order might step in to provide funds. Monastic communities, in particular, played a role in ransom. The Mercedarians, a Catholic order founded in the 13th century, devoted themselves to freeing Christian captives, raising money through alms and donations. Though their efforts focused largely on prisoners of war held by non-Christian powers, their work reflected a broader belief that ransom was a duty of mercy. Still, for every prisoner who found a benefactor, many more languished. Their lives trickled away in slow confinement, each day marked by the absence of payment. For them, captivity became less about ransom and more about survival. The simple act of enduring another day in a cell, of holding on to a shred of hope, was itself a form of resistance. This raises a deeper question: when ransom failed, when captivity stretched into years or decades, how did prisoners endure the daily grind of confinement? What strategies did they develop to survive the boredom, the hunger, and the uncertainty of lives left on hold? If you were a medieval prisoner whose ransom was never paid, the question of survival became the central concern of daily life. You had already endured the first shock of capture, the long months of waiting, and the devastating news that your family or community could not raise the necessary funds. Now, the struggle was no longer about returning home, it was about learning how to endure captivity indefinitely. The first challenge was physical. Food, never plentiful in most prisons, became even more uncertain for those with no ransom on the horizon. Captors who once had reason to keep a wealthy noble alive and healthy now had little incentive to invest resources in lesser men. Many prisoners survived on the barest rations, bread made from coarse flour, thin broth flavored with little more than bones, or, in desperate times, scraps unfit for household servants. Malnutrition left men weak, their bodies prone to illness. Teeth loosened from lack of nutrition, wounds healed poorly, and energy dwindled. In crowded cells, disease was a constant threat. Fleas, lice, and rats thrived in damp, unwashed environments. Dysentery, fevers, and infections swept through groups of prisoners. Medieval medicine offered little relief, and even if a physician was available, captors rarely wasted funds on the care of those unlikely to fetch ransom. Survival often came down to luck, the strength of one's constitution, the ability to avoid infection, and the fortune of finding scraps of food or clean water. Yet humans are resourceful, even in confinement. Prisoners developed small strategies to endure. Some fashioned tools from scraps of metal, bone, or wood, sharpened sticks for picking food, makeshift needles for repairing clothing, or crude dice carved from discarded material for passing time. Others created routines, dividing their days into patterns of prayer, exercise, and conversation, anchoring their minds against the formlessness of endless waiting. For the religious, prayer provided not only structure but also a sense of meaning. Many prisoners clung to the belief that suffering was a test, that patience in captivity brought spiritual merit. Psalms were recited aloud, rosaries fashioned from pebbles, and prayers whispered in the dark. Captors sometimes allowed chaplains or friars to visit, offering confession and communion, though such visits were rare. Still, faith gave many the strength to endure conditions that might otherwise have broken them. Other men turned to companionship. In shared cells, bonds formed between prisoners. They shared stories of their homes, tales of past battles, or dreams of freedom. They sang songs quietly in the evenings, creating a fragile sense of community. Such relationships could mean the difference between despair and endurance. When illness struck, fellow captives might share food or water, or cover a shivering companion with scraps of cloth. Even in the most desolate cells, the human instinct to connect remained a lifeline. Not all strategies were noble. Some prisoners bargained with their captors, offering services in exchange for slightly better treatment. Skilled men, scribes, blacksmiths, or soldiers, could sometimes find roles within the castle or household. A scribe might draft letters, a craftsman repair tools, a soldier serve in a garrison. While this did not guarantee freedom, it offered a reprieve from the worst conditions of neglect. In this sense, captivity blurred into servitude, as prisoners traded labor for survival. And then there were those who broke. The monotony, hunger, and hopelessness overwhelmed them. Chroniclers mention prisoners who fell into madness, their minds unraveling under the weight of despair. Some refused food, choosing death over the endless cycle of waiting. Others lashed out violently, attacking guards or fellow prisoners, only to face harsher punishments, heavier chains, darker cells, and stricter isolation. Such stories remind us that survival was not only a matter of physical endurance but also of mental resilience. Occasionally, fate shifted. Even when a ransom seemed impossible, circumstances could change. Wars ended, alliances shifted, or captors died. A prisoner held for years might suddenly find himself freed, either because his captor no longer found him useful, or because new rulers sought to clear out old debts. In rare instances, prisoners were released as acts of mercy during religious festivals, or as part of peace treaties. Such releases were unpredictable, but they kept alive the faint possibility of freedom. Some prisoners, especially those of lower status, were absorbed into the communities of their captors. Over time, they became part of the local population, working as servants, laborers, or even soldiers. Their original identities faded, replaced by new roles in unfamiliar lands. This was not freedom in the true sense, but it was survival, a way of escaping the confines of a cell by blending into the fabric of daily life. For nobles, the stakes were different. A captured lord whose family could not raise ransom risked humiliation. His diminished status might become permanent, his power at home slipping into the hands of rivals. Some chose to write wills from captivity, acknowledging that they might never return. Others, desperate to preserve dignity, offered oaths of loyalty to their captors, trading allegiance for release. Such choices reveal the fragile line between honor and survival in a world where status defined identity. When we step back, the stories of unpaid ransom prisoners tell us something essential about the Middle Ages. Freedom was never a right, but a privilege. It depended on wealth, family, and fortune. A noble could expect to see his home again, but a poor soldier often could not. The system of ransom, for all its legal formality and cultural significance, left countless men forgotten in dark cells, their lives measured not in deeds but in debts. And yet, these forgotten men shaped history in subtle ways. Their absences altered families, shifted power within communities, and even changed the outcomes of wars. The loss of soldiers weakened armies, the capture of leaders strained towns and villages. Every prisoner who did not return left a gap that others had to fill. The medieval world was built not only on the actions of kings and knights but also on the silent suffering of those who never made it home. As the centuries passed, the system of ransom began to fade. By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, professional armies and centralized states replaced the older, more personal structures of warfare. Captivity still existed, but the culture of ransom shifted, becoming less central to war. Yet for those who lived in the heart of the Middle Ages, ransom was a defining reality, a reality that decided who lived in freedom and who wasted away behind stone walls. And so, the story of medieval prisoners who could not pay their ransom ends not with triumph or dramatic escape, but with endurance. Their legacy is not one of heroism, but of survival in the dullest, harshest sense. They remind us that history is not only made by victories and grand events, but also by the forgotten struggles of ordinary men caught in the machinery of war. It leaves us with a question: in a world where freedom itself carried a price, how many lives were lost not on the battlefield, but in the slow erosion of captivity, waiting for a ransom that would never come. When we think of ransom in the Middle Ages, it is easy to imagine it as a simple transaction: one side captures a prisoner, the other pays money, and the captive is released. But the reality was far more complicated. Ransom was not just about money, it was a system of contracts, promises, negotiations, and shifting values that reflected the economic foundations of medieval society. To begin, you must imagine how wealth was measured in a world before banks, paper money, or modern credit systems. Coins existed, of course, struck in silver or gold, but many people lived with very little coinage in their daily lives. Wealth was tied to land, livestock, crops, and the labor of peasants. So when a ransom was demanded, the question immediately arose: how could it be paid? For a nobleman, the sum could be enormous. Chroniclers record ransoms that reached into the tens of thousands of livres or marks, amounts that represented entire estates. The most famous example is perhaps King Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, who was captured in 1192 on his return from the Third Crusade. His ransom was set at 150,000 marks, a staggering sum equal to several years of England's entire royal income. To meet this demand, taxes were levied across the realm, churches stripped of valuables, and countless families forced to contribute. The ransom was not simply a fee, it was a national economic event, shaping the lives of ordinary people who had never seen a king. But not all ransoms were so grand. Most were smaller, negotiated sums meant to reflect the captive's social status. The key principle was that ransom should be reasonable, in proportion to rank. A knight was worth more than a common soldier, a lord was worth more than a knight, a king was worth more than all. This hierarchy turned social order into an economic scale, where the value of a person could be measured in coins. The mechanics of ransom were built on contracts. A captured knight did not simply hand over money and walk free. Instead, he often signed a formal agreement known as a letter of ransom. These documents spelled out the terms of release, the amount owed, the deadlines for payment, and the conditions under which the captive would remain free. If the sum could not be paid immediately, the prisoner might be released on parole, swearing an oath to return to captivity if the money was not delivered. Breaking such an oath was not only dishonorable but could lead to excommunication by the church, since ransom agreements were considered sacred promises. Sometimes, hostages were taken as security. If a noble was freed before full payment, he might leave behind a son, brother, or trusted retainer to guarantee the deal. These hostages lived under the same uncertainties as prisoners, waiting until the agreed sum was met. In a few cases, hostages themselves died in captivity, leaving behind bitter disputes over whether the ransom had been truly fulfilled. The logistics of raising ransom were complex. Wealth was not stored in neat piles of coins but scattered across estates. Land might have to be mortgaged, rents collected early, or livestock sold. Families borrowed from moneylenders, including Jewish financiers in many parts of Europe, despite the high interest rates. Monasteries and churches were sometimes pressured to contribute, either by pawning relics or melting down chalices and crosses to mint coin. The process of turning static wealth into liquid money could take months or years, and during that time, the prisoner remained in limbo. For lesser nobles and knights, the sums were smaller but still burdensome. A ransom of 300 livres might not bankrupt an estate, but it could require years of careful management to repay debts incurred. Even after a prisoner's release, the financial shadow lingered. Families who had strained their resources to pay ransom often found themselves weakened, their estates fragmented or indebted. In this way, ransom payments rippled outward, reshaping the economic and social landscape of entire regions. Ransom also fueled the economy of war itself. For captors, the promise of ransom was an incentive not to kill but to capture. A knight on the battlefield might fight less fiercely if he knew he could be worth more alive than dead. Captors sometimes even competed to claim high-ranking prisoners, since the one who physically secured the capture usually held the right to ransom. This led to disputes and lawsuits, with courts deciding who had the legitimate claim to a prisoner's value. The practice extended beyond Christian Europe. In conflicts with Muslim states, particularly during the Crusades, ransom and prisoner exchanges were common. Negotiations might involve not only money but also the release of captives on both sides. Truces were sometimes brokered with the understanding that prisoners would be freed in exchange for agreed sums. Across the Mediterranean, the ransoming of captives became a recognized, if often bitter, part of warfare. And yet, for all its contractual formality, ransom remained precarious. Payments could be interrupted by war, theft, or death. Caravans carrying silver might be robbed on the road, a family promising to raise money might collapse under the burden. In such cases, disputes dragged on for years, with letters exchanged, envoys sent, and courts petitioned. Some men died before their ransom was fully resolved, leaving heirs to negotiate the remaining balance. The economics of ransom thus reveals a world where freedom was deeply entangled with wealth and contracts. A man's value was quantified in coin, his honor secured by oaths, and his fate decided by the ability of his kin to transform land and goods into money. It was a system that shaped not only the lives of individuals but also the broader rhythms of medieval society, fueling wars, straining communities, and binding people together through promises sealed with wax and blood. But behind the contracts and coins lies a deeper question: how did captors decide what a man was worth, and what happened when that value was disputed? When we left off, the question lingered: how did captors decide what a man was worth? In theory, ransom was guided by custom, tradition, and a sense of reasonableness. In practice, it was an uncertain art, blending social rank, economic capacity, and sheer negotiation skill. The foundation of ransom value was status. In a rigidly hierarchical society, rank determined nearly everything, where one sat at the Lord's table, whose judgment carried weight in court, and, in captivity, how much one's life was worth. At the top of the scale were kings and princes. Their ransoms were astronomical, not only because of their personal wealth but because releasing them meant restoring political stability. Capturing a king could alter the balance of power across entire regions. The example of King John II of France illustrates this clearly. Captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, his ransom was set at 3 million écus, a colossal sum. To meet it, the French crown imposed heavy taxes, mortgaged lands, and strained the kingdom's resources. The ransom was not just the price of a man but the price of a monarchy. Below kings came great lords and barons, valued for their landholdings and influence. Their ransoms varied widely but often matched the annual income of their estates. A lord controlling fertile lands might fetch more than one whose estates were poor or ravaged by war. In this way, ransom valuations reflected the uneven geography of wealth, with captors carefully calculating how much a family could realistically pay. Knights formed the next tier. Their ransoms were usually modest compared to lords but still significant. A knight's equipment, armor, horses, and weapons, was itself valuable and often seized by captors alongside the man. Ransom amounts were often set in relation to the cost of outfitting a knight, reflecting both his martial role and his social standing. At the bottom of the ransom ladder were common soldiers and peasants. Most of them were not worth ransoming at all. The effort of feeding and guarding a poor man outweighed any profit his release might bring. Many were simply released without payment, either left to walk home or abandoned to fend for themselves. Others were forced into labor, serving their captors in fields or workshops. Their value lay not in coin but in what their bodies could produce. But status alone did not decide ransom. Context mattered. The circumstances of capture, the wealth of the captive's family, and the broader political climate all influenced the sum. If a noble came from a wealthy region or had kin eager to protect their interests, his ransom might be set higher. If he was captured in the chaos of a retreat, his captors might accept less, fearing he would otherwise die of wounds or escape. Negotiation was central to the process. Captors wanted as much money as possible, but they also risked asking too much. A ransom set too high might never be paid, leaving them stuck with a useless prisoner. Skilled negotiators, often clerics or professional agents, stepped in to bargain. These intermediaries wrote letters, traveled between courts, and tried to bridge the gap between demand and reality. Some cases dragged on for years, with captives released on parole to raise funds while disputes continued. The Church's role in setting ransom values cannot be overlooked. Councils and canon law repeatedly emphasized that ransom should be fair, not ruinous. Excessive demands were condemned as sinful, and oaths sworn on ransom contracts carried spiritual weight. Breaking a ransom agreement could result in excommunication. In this way, the Church attempted to regulate the system, though enforcement was uneven and often ignored in the heat of war. One fascinating aspect of ransom pricing was its relationship to chivalry. Knights and nobles were expected to treat captured peers with a degree of honor. This did not mean generosity, ransom was still expected, but it did mean that negotiations were wrapped in the language of respect. A noble might address his captive politely, dine with him, or allow him certain freedoms, all while pressing for payment. To mistreat a captive of rank was seen as dishonorable, damaging the captor's reputation within the knightly class. Yet the system was rife with disputes. What if a captive insisted he was of lower status than claimed? What if his family pleaded poverty, while his captor believed otherwise? Lawsuits erupted over such questions. Records from medieval courts show detailed debates over the true value of a man. Witnesses testified about landholdings, income, and social rank. Judges weighed whether a ransom demand was excessive. These cases reveal how deeply embedded ransom was in the legal fabric of medieval life. The valuation of captives also reveals stark inequalities. While nobles were valued and treated with respect, ordinary soldiers were often slaughtered or enslaved after battles. At Crécy and Agincourt, chroniclers describe how English forces killed thousands of prisoners when the burden of guarding them became too great. The decision of who lived and who died was, in effect, a calculation of economic worth. The influence of ransom extended beyond the battlefield. Families had to weigh the cost of paying ransom against other needs. Was it worth selling land to free a relative? Could they risk plunging their estate into debt? Some families hesitated, and not all captives were redeemed. For every noble who returned home, another lingered in captivity because his kin judged the cost too high. At times, politics skewed ransom values dramatically. A prisoner might be valued not for his personal wealth but for the leverage his release carried. A lord with influential allies could command a higher price. Conversely, a captive whose faction had fallen from power might be worth little, even if his estates were large. Thus, ransom functioned not only as an economic practice but as a tool of political strategy. Consider again the case of Richard the Lionheart. His ransom was not only enormous but symbolic. To the German Emperor Henry VI, holding Richard was a chance to assert power over one of Europe's most famous monarchs. To England, paying the ransom was a statement of loyalty and strength. The scale of the demand was as much about politics as it was about money. In this light, ransom pricing emerges as a mirror of medieval values. It reflected the rigid hierarchies of class, the fragility of wealth, and the intertwining of honor and economics. It also exposed the cruel realities beneath the chivalric veneer. To be worth ransoming was to be recognized as part of the elite. To be worthless was, often, to be disposable. And yet, even within this harsh system, disputes remained constant. How could one prove the value of a man, and who had the final say? These unresolved debates shaped not only individual fates but entire conflicts, which leads us to the final question in this story: when disputes dragged on, when money failed to appear, and when contracts broke down, what happened? Next. The system of ransom rested on a fragile balance. It required trust between captor and captive, wealth from families and kingdoms, and respect for the codes of chivalry that held it all together. But what happened when that balance broke? When money did not arrive, when agreements were dishonored, or when desperation outweighed honor, the carefully constructed world of ransom could collapse in unpredictable, and often brutal, ways. The first and most obvious risk was non-payment. Captors might hold their prisoner for months or years, waiting for promised sums that never came. If a family proved unable, or unwilling, to raise the funds, negotiations stalled. The captive remained in limbo, caught between hope and despair. Many medieval chronicles describe noble prisoners languishing for years in castles, monasteries, or fortified towns. Their captivity could become a way of life, with limited freedom but no certainty of release. At times, captors grew impatient. When funds failed to arrive, some turned to coercion. Prisoners were threatened, mistreated, or paraded in humiliating conditions to pressure their families. While outright torture was frowned upon in chivalric circles, it did occur, especially when captors came from outside the knightly elite. Mercenary companies, bands of professional soldiers without the polish of noble upbringing, were notorious for such practices. They cared little for honor and much for profit. For them, ransom was a business, and a stubborn prisoner was simply a bad investment to be squeezed harder, but captors, too, faced risks. Holding a prisoner was costly. Feeding, guarding, and housing a captive, especially one of high rank, required resources. Worse, captors could themselves fall into misfortune. A knight guarding a lord might be killed in battle or lose his lands, leaving the prisoner in the hands of strangers. In some cases, captives were sold like commodities passed from one lord or mercenary band to another. Each transfer complicated negotiations, and with every change of hands, the risk of betrayal or abuse increased. The breakdown of ransom agreements could also spark political crises. When King John II of France was released after paying only part of his ransom in 1360, the agreement included hostages, his own sons, who were left in English custody until the remaining payments were made. When John returned to France and discovered that the payments had stalled, he did something remarkable: he went back to captivity voluntarily in 1364, citing his honor and oath. Few monarchs followed such an example. More often, unpaid ransoms led to bitter disputes between kingdoms, each accusing the other of treachery. Honor, of course, was supposed to be the glue holding the system together. A knight or noble released on parole, sworn by oath to raise his ransom and return if he failed, was expected to keep his word. And many did. Medieval chronicles praise captives who came back voluntarily, even when they had failed to raise the money. Such stories reinforced the ideal of chivalry, that one's word was binding, even against personal interest. But not everyone lived up to the code. Some captives broke their oaths, disappearing into friendly territory and refusing to return. Others exaggerated their poverty, claiming they could not pay while secretly hoarding wealth. In such cases, captors might pursue legal action in ecclesiastical courts, seeking excommunication for oath-breakers. Yet enforcement was patchy, and in the chaos of war, honor often gave way to convenience. At the extreme, the collapse of ransom negotiations could mean death. Captors had little incentive to keep a prisoner who could not pay and who drained resources. Sometimes, such men were executed outright, their deaths serving as grim warnings to others. Chroniclers recount instances of entire groups of prisoners being slaughtered when their ransoms proved worthless. The massacre of French prisoners after the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 is perhaps the most infamous example. Though motivated partly by battlefield circumstances, it reflected the brutal logic that captives were valuable only so long as they could be ransomed. Even when death was avoided, some prisoners faced lifelong captivity. Unable to secure release, they remained in castles or towns for years, slowly fading from memory. Their stories echo faintly in the records, letters pleading for mercy, account books noting the costs of their upkeep, contracts of ransom never fulfilled. To be forgotten in this way was a fate nearly as cruel as death, a slow erasure of one's place in society. The collapse of ransom also exposed the limits of chivalric ideals. Knights spoke of honor, mercy, and mutual respect, yet economic reality often trumped these values. Poor captives were discarded, rich ones exploited, and oaths broken when convenient. Ransom, for all its ritual and tradition, was never free from the harsh calculations of power and survival. At times, the system's failures reshaped warfare itself. Soldiers learned that capturing a wealthy foe could be more profitable than killing him. But when ransoms failed, when promises went unpaid, and when captives died uselessly, the incentive weakened. This unpredictability pushed some armies toward more ruthless strategies, valuing swift victory and plunder over the delicate negotiations of ransom. And yet, even in failure, ransom remained central to the medieval experience of war. Its breakdown revealed not only the fragility of trust but also the desperate human struggle beneath the politics of kings and the codes of knights. Captives were sons, fathers, and brothers, their lives balanced on the uncertain scales of wealth and honor. The collapse of ransom teaches us a final lesson: in the Middle Ages, survival was not guaranteed by courage or skill alone. It depended on being worth enough to someone, family, lord, or kingdom, to justify the price of one's freedom. Those deemed worthless often disappeared into death or obscurity, their names forgotten. Those deemed valuable returned home, sometimes broken by years of waiting, but alive. Thus, the economics of ransom were never just about money. They were about identity, status, and the fragile web of trust in a violent world. And when that web broke, it revealed the raw truth beneath the ideals of chivalry, that life itself could be weighed, priced, and, too often, discarded. When you imagine a medieval prison, your mind might wander to cold stone dungeons, iron shackles, and the damp smell of mildew lingering in the darkness. The popular image is grim, and in some ways accurate, but in truth, the architecture of captivity in the Middle Ages was more varied, subtle, and ordinary than legend suggests. If you were a prisoner who could not pay your ransom, the place of your confinement might not be a dungeon at all, but a room in a castle, a monastery cloister, or even a guarded home in town. The very word prison in the medieval world did not mean what it does today. There was no standardized penal system across Europe. Instead, confinement was situational. Some prisoners were held temporarily while awaiting ransom, others were confined for years as political hostages or criminal offenders. A single town could have multiple types of holding places: city towers, castle basements, and even borrowed rooms rented for confinement. Most noble prisoners, especially those of military rank, were held in castles. Castles were not merely fortresses of defense, they were also centers of administration, residences, and symbols of authority. When a lord captured an enemy knight, it was only natural to confine him within the stone walls of his own seat of power. The accommodations varied widely. A wealthy noble, expected to pay a large ransom, might be given a chamber that was reasonably comfortable, with a bed, a window, and access to servants. After all, keeping such a prisoner alive and relatively healthy increased the chances of receiving the ransom. Chronicles from the Hundred Years' War note that English captors sometimes treated high-ranking French prisoners with courtesy, allowing them to dine at the same table as their jailers. But not every captive was so fortunate. In the lower chambers of castles, there were often rooms designed specifically for holding difficult or less valuable prisoners. These ranged from small stone cells to damp basements where daylight barely reached. Iron rings fixed to the walls or floors allowed shackles to be attached. Straw might be thrown on the ground as bedding, though it quickly became soiled. The air could be stagnant, and vermin were constant companions. For prisoners unable to pay ransom, such accommodations could become permanent. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and the monotony of stone walls pressed heavily on the mind. Another common site of captivity was the monastery. Religious houses often had the architectural resources to confine people securely: thick walls, enclosed cloisters, and a disciplined community of monks or nuns who could act as guards. Monastic imprisonment had a different character from that of castles. While castles emphasized control through strength and intimidation, monasteries leaned toward moral reform and spiritual discipline. Captives held in monasteries often lived under strict rules of silence and prayer. Meals were meager, consisting of bread, pottage, and ale. The rhythm of the monastic day, bells marking hours of worship, shaped their experience of time. For a noble who once feasted and hunted, this was its own kind of torment, not physical cruelty, but endless spiritual monotony. And yet, some prisoners found monasteries to be more tolerable than castles. The atmosphere was less violent, and monks sometimes acted with kindness. Prisoners might be allowed access to books, writing materials, or opportunities to learn Latin psalms. For those who had no ransom and no prospects of release, captivity in a monastery could become a strange kind of education in patience and humility. In cities, imprisonment often took place in towers or specially built civic prisons. These structures were usually attached to town halls, gates, or bridges, making them both secure and visible symbols of justice. London's infamous Tower, though primarily a royal fortress, often served as a place of imprisonment for nobles, traders, and debtors. But smaller towns had their own equivalents: gatehouse prisons, bridge towers, or chambers above market halls. Such places were less comfortable than castles and more public than monasteries. Prisoners might be placed where townsfolk could hear their complaints or even see them through barred windows. The visibility was intentional. Captivity in civic prisons reminded the population of the consequences of disobedience. A prisoner who could not pay his ransom might become a familiar figure in town, his presence both a warning and a source of gossip. Sometimes, especially for lower-value captives, imprisonment was surprisingly informal. Instead of being locked in a tower, a prisoner might be kept in the home of his captor under watch. Guards or family members ensured he did not escape. He might share meals with his captor's household, participate in chores, or sit idly in the courtyard. While this was less severe than dungeon confinement, it could last just as long. In these cases, captivity blurred the line between prison and fosterage. A prisoner became part of the household economy, eating its food, perhaps helping with its work, but always under watchful eyes. For a man without ransom, such an arrangement could stretch indefinitely, neither fully prisoner nor free guest. No matter where imprisonment took place, the physical tools of confinement were often similar. Iron chains, wooden stocks, barred windows, and heavy doors created the material reality of being trapped. Shackles were particularly common for those suspected of planning escape. Rings set into the floor or walls allowed chains to be fastened securely. Keys, jealously guarded by jailers, were symbols of power. The clink of iron and the scrape of bolts marked the rhythms of a prisoner's day. In some places, prisoners were branded or marked to discourage escape. More often, though, the architecture itself was deterrent enough: high walls, narrow passages, and watchful guards, perhaps the most punishing aspect of captivity was not the architecture but the experience of time itself. For a captive unable to pay ransom, days lost meaning. Without the responsibilities of battle, court, or landholding, life became an endless waiting. Prisoners marked time in scratches on the wall, in prayers repeated daily, in the slow cycle of seasons glimpsed through a narrow window. A summer breeze might remind them of freedom, while winter cold seeped cruelly through the stones. The monotony wore down even the strongest spirits. Captivity, especially when indefinite, was a test of endurance not just of the body, but of the mind. What did survival look like in these conditions? For many, it depended on small acts of adaptation. Prisoners fashioned makeshift games from stones, recited poems from memory, or carved wood to pass the time. Those in monasteries turned to prayer, while those in castles sought conversation with guards. A friendly jailer could mean the difference between despair and endurance. Food, too, shaped survival. While noble captives might receive decent meals, those of lesser means often survived on watery broth, coarse bread, and thin ale. Malnutrition was common. Prison accounts sometimes list expenses for feeding captives, reminding us that food was as much a calculation of cost as a necessity of survival. Not all prisoners were treated equally. Just as in the outside world, captivity reproduced the hierarchies of class and wealth. Noble prisoners who promised large ransoms were treated with care, given space and privileges, sometimes even allowed to keep servants. Those who could not pay were crowded into dark cells, chained, and left to languish. This hierarchy reinforced a cruel truth: captivity was not just about security, but about value. The worth of a prisoner determined the conditions of his survival. When you look closely at the architecture of medieval captivity, you begin to see a world built not for punishment alone, but for waiting. Castles, monasteries, towers, and homes all served as places where human beings were stored until money, politics, or mercy decided their fate. For prisoners unable to pay ransom, that waiting could stretch endlessly. The architecture of captivity became the architecture of a life half erased, present but powerless, alive but forgotten. And yet, these walls, chains, and cells were not just physical. They were symbols of a deeper reality. In the medieval world, freedom was not a right but a commodity. If you could not afford it, you learned to live within stone and silence. But what happened to the minds of those who endured this waiting? How did the psychology of captivity shape their thoughts, dreams, and sense of self as the years passed? If the stone walls, iron shackles, and meager meals created the physical world of captivity, the true prison often existed in the mind. For those unable to pay ransom, who faced indefinite confinement, the psychological effects of captivity could be as profound and enduring as the loss of freedom itself. To live as a prisoner in the Middle Ages was to experience time in suspension, dignity in question, and identity under strain. Perhaps the most crushing aspect of medieval imprisonment was uncertainty. Few captives knew how long they would be held, or whether ransom negotiations might succeed. For those without money, the future was even more uncertain. There was always a chance, remote but present, that a family member, a patron, or a sympathetic lord might step in with payment. Yet there was also the looming possibility that no one would. This uncertainty was corrosive. Hope flickered, but so too did despair. Days might pass in anticipation of news, only to stretch into months of silence. Prisoners clung to rumors, letters, or whispers from guards. A visitor bearing word from home could transform a man's spirit for days, even if the message contained no concrete promise. Silence, on the other hand, eroded hope until some prisoners ceased asking questions at all. In this way, captivity created a peculiar rhythm of expectation and disappointment. A captive might awaken each day imagining freedom, only to end it resigned once more to the sameness of stone and straw. For nobles and knights, captivity carried another psychological wound, the loss of status. In a world where honor and reputation defined a man's worth, being reduced to the condition of a dependent, or worse, a forgotten debtor, was humiliating. Knights prided themselves on courage, loyalty, and chivalric standing. But what happened to those values when one was chained in a cell, unable to act? Chronicles describe knights begging their captors for leniency, pleading with families for money, or lamenting that they had become useless. The shame of being unable to pay ransom cut deeply. A knight who once commanded men and lands could now be compared to a pauper, stripped of agency. This loss of identity extended beyond nobility. Merchants, clerks, or artisans captured in raids also suffered the disorienting shift from independence to captivity. To be a prisoner was to become invisible to society. Business, property, and family ties weakened over time. Children grew without fathers, wives struggled to manage households alone, and communities moved on. A captive could return years later to find himself a stranger in his own home. Faced with the crushing monotony of captivity, prisoners developed coping mechanisms. These were not formal strategies, but small, improvised ways of surviving psychologically. Some turned to religion. Monks, priests, and devout laymen urged captives to interpret their suffering as spiritual trial. Prayer, confession, and the reading of psalms offered comfort. Prisoners might recite entire books of the Bible from memory, using scripture to structure their days. Captivity, in this view, became a test of endurance granted by God, with patience as the highest virtue. Others turned to creativity. In cells, prisoners carved graffiti into the walls, scratched poems into plaster, or composed songs to pass the hours. The Tower of London still preserves inscriptions made by imprisoned nobles, names, coats of arms, and even verses etched into stone. These marks were not only acts of defiance but ways to assert identity in the face of erasure. Still others relied on routine. Prisoners created makeshift schedules, morning prayers, exercise in the cell, conversations with fellow captives if allowed. Routine turned endless time into manageable portions. Without such order, days could blur into a haze of despair. Isolation was another powerful force. Some prisoners, especially high-value captives, were kept alone for security reasons. Solitary confinement could intensify feelings of helplessness. The silence of stone walls, broken only by the sound of guards' footsteps or the creak of doors, pressed heavily on the mind. Others were kept in groups. While this allowed for companionship, it also brought tensions. Different social ranks mixed uneasily. Nobles might disdain sharing a cell with common soldiers, while poor captives resented the privileges of wealthy ones. Quarrels over food, bedding, or rumor could erupt, making confinement as stressful as isolation. Communication with the outside world was lifeblood for captives. A letter from family, even brief, reaffirmed identity and connection. Some captors allowed correspondence, especially if it encouraged ransom negotiations. Others restricted it, fearing escape plots. Prison letters often mixed practical requests, send money, clothing, food, with emotional appeals, remember me, do not forget my plight. To write was to assert existence, to remind both self and family that one still lived. But unanswered letters brought despair. A prisoner who wrote again and again without reply might begin to believe he had been abandoned. The silence could break a spirit more surely than iron chains. Captivity reshaped imagination. Prisoners dreamed of freedom so vividly that it became almost real. They pictured riding across open fields, eating rich foods, or reuniting with loved ones. These fantasies sustained them, but they also sharpened pain when reality intruded. Some dreams took darker forms. Chroniclers describe prisoners who believed themselves cursed, forgotten by God, or doomed to die in obscurity. In this way, captivity blurred the boundary between hope and madness. Not all captives submitted quietly. Some resisted in subtle ways. They bribed guards, spread false rumors, or plotted escapes. Carving graffiti into walls was itself an act of defiance, proof that even within confinement, one could mark the world. Other forms of resistance were symbolic. Refusing to eat certain foods, rejecting humiliating tasks, or insisting on knightly dignity in dress and speech allowed captives to preserve a sense of self. These small acts of resistance did not free them, but they maintained the belief that captivity had not erased identity entirely. For some, however, the strain was too great. Medieval sources occasionally describe prisoners who fell into despair so deep that they ceased speaking, eating, or caring for themselves. Chronic malnutrition and hopelessness could combine to produce physical collapse. Others slipped into madness. Endless silence, darkness, and uncertainty warped thought. Prisoners muttered to themselves, raved at guards, or imagined conspiracies. While medieval observers lacked modern psychological vocabulary, they recognized the toll captivity took on the mind, yet, over time, captivity could become strangely normal. Some prisoners adjusted so fully that release became unsettling. After years of confinement, freedom could feel disorienting. Accounts of released captives describe men overwhelmed by open skies, unfamiliar streets, and the noise of markets. Captivity, for all its misery, created a routine that freedom disrupted. This adaptation was itself a survival strategy. By accepting imprisonment as daily reality, captives reduced the torment of waiting. The danger, of course, was resignation, the quiet acceptance that freedom might never come. Psychologically, captivity was a battle against being forgotten. Prisoners feared not just death, but erasure. If no ransom was paid, if no letter came, if years passed unnoticed, a man's existence seemed to vanish from the living world. This is why so many captives carved names, dates, and prayers into walls. These marks were insurance against oblivion. Even if the body died, the name would remain. Ultimately, the psychology of captivity asked a fundamental question: who are you, when stripped of freedom, wealth, and social role? Knights, merchants, and peasants alike had to confront this reality. Some rebuilt identity through faith, others through defiance, still others through despair. For those unable to pay ransom, the question lingered indefinitely. They were not warriors, not lords, not citizens, they were simply prisoners. But how did this suspended identity affect the families left behind? What was the psychological and social impact of a father, husband, or son who never returned, whose absence stretched into years of uncertainty? When a prisoner could not pay ransom, captivity often stretched not into weeks or months, but years, and sometimes even lifetimes. The end of captivity, when it came, rarely provided a clean resolution. Release could mean freedom, but also dislocation. Death in prison meant finality, but also silence. And the echoes of captivity extended beyond the walls of cells into the lives of families, communities, and even kingdoms. For the fortunate few, release eventually came. Sometimes it followed a sudden stroke of generosity, a lord remitting a debt, a king ordering the release of captives to mark a treaty, or a wealthy relative stepping forward with the necessary funds. At other times, captors tired of keeping a useless prisoner and let him go simply to reduce expenses. But freedom was rarely the joyous homecoming we imagine. For one thing, years of captivity left scars. A prisoner who had spent a decade in a castle basement or monastery cell returned with a body weakened by malnutrition, joints stiff from inactivity, and spirit burdened by memory. The adjustment to freedom could be disorienting. There are accounts of men released after long captivity who could not walk properly, or who wept uncontrollably at the sight of familiar landscapes. Some returned to find families fractured, estates mismanaged, or wives remarried under the assumption that the captive was dead. The home they longed for during years of imprisonment often no longer existed in the same form. Release also carried the weight of stigma. A noble who had been captured and held without ransom might be seen as diminished, his honor tarnished. Even if captivity was not his fault, the fact of his confinement could weaken his reputation in the ruthless politics of court and battlefield. While the prisoner endured physical walls, families endured invisible ones. Wives, children, and relatives of captives lived in limbo. If ransom was possible, they faced the crushing task of raising sums of money that might exceed the value of their estates. Lands were mortgaged, treasures pawned, and alliances sought. For families without means, the situation was worse. Helplessness replaced hope. Letters from prisoners often begged families not to forget them, but the burden was heavy. A wife managing children, land, and finances might quietly resent the absent husband whose captivity consumed resources. Communities, too, faced strain. A missing head of household could disrupt local economies, leaving tenants and workers uncertain. Sometimes, families moved on. Children grew to adulthood, marriages were arranged, and life reshaped itself without the prisoner. When he returned, if he returned, he entered a world that had adapted to his absence. This could deepen the sense of alienation. For many prisoners who could not pay ransom, captivity ended not with release, but with death. Some died of disease in damp cells, others from malnutrition or neglect. Records sometimes note expenses for burying prisoners, showing that their deaths were treated with practical, bureaucratic efficiency. Death in captivity was often anonymous. Unlike a knight who fell gloriously in battle, the captive who wasted away in a dungeon left little memory behind. Families might never learn the exact circumstances, only that their relative had died in prison. For the medieval imagination, this was a lonely fate, without the honor of battlefield sacrifice or the closure of a Christian burial among kin. Yet even in death, captives could leave marks. Graffiti carved into stone walls, scraps of poetry, or prayers left behind in manuscripts testify to lives endured in waiting. These remnants allow us to hear faint echoes of voices that might otherwise have been lost entirely. From a broader perspective, long-term captivity reveals the economic coldness of the medieval world. Prisoners were valuable so long as they promised ransom. Without that value, they became burdens. Captors weighed the costs of feeding and guarding against the potential of payment. When costs outweighed hope, neglect followed. This economy extended into state policy. Kings might release masses of prisoners after treaties, not for mercy but to reduce expenses or to free resources for new campaigns. Individuals, however, remained trapped in calculations they could not control. Their lives were shaped by ledgers, debts, and contracts that placed a price on human freedom. Beyond the personal, captivity left marks on culture and imagination. Chroniclers, poets, and theologians used imprisonment as a metaphor for sin, exile, or spiritual trial. The writings of prisoners themselves often describe captivity as both physical and moral struggle, a testing ground for patience, humility, and faith. Knights who endured long captivity sometimes re-emerged with reputations for endurance, using their experience as moral capital. Religious writers described prison as a place where the soul learned detachment from worldly pleasures. Even kings, like Richard the Lionheart, famously held captive in Germany, became remembered in ballads and stories that transformed captivity into legend. For ordinary captives, however, there was no such transformation. Their captivity faded into obscurity, their lives forgotten except in the dry records of account books. This contrast underscores the inequality of memory. Nobles turned into stories, peasants into silence. Captivity also shaped communities. Villages that lost men to raids or wars found themselves disrupted. A missing head of household meant uncertainty for tenants, disputes over inheritance, or even abandonment of land. The absence of ransom, reflecting poverty, was not just a family problem but a community one. In some cases, captives were ransomed not by family but by towns or guilds, who pooled resources to bring men home. When that was impossible, the community adapted, redistributing labor and responsibility. In this way, captivity had ripple effects far beyond the walls of prison cells. The long shadow of captivity teaches us much about medieval life. It reveals a world where freedom was not assumed, where survival depended on networks of wealth and loyalty, and where the worth of a man could be reduced to the contents of a ledger. It also shows the resilience of those who endured. In their prayers, graffiti, and letters, we see human beings refusing erasure. They found ways to cope with uncertainty, to mark their presence, and to cling to identity even in the face of neglect. As you consider the forgotten captives of the Middle Ages, you may find yourself reflecting on freedom itself. Today, we assume it as a right, but for much of history, it was fragile, easily lost, and often priced. To be free was to be valued, to be captive without ransom was to live in suspension, half forgotten. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: how many lives disappeared into the silence of prison walls, never recorded, never remembered, their existence reduced to a line in an account book or a fading mark on stone? When you imagine the Middle Ages, you might think of knights charging into battle, castles looming over countryside, or monks quietly copying manuscripts. Yet hidden within that world was another, less romantic image: the bustling, pragmatic business of ransom. For every prisoner taken on the battlefield or in a raid, negotiations, brokers, and elaborate transactions followed. It was, in many ways, a marketplace of human freedom, where liberty was bought, sold, and bargained for like any other commodity. In medieval warfare, capture was often more profitable than killing. To kill an enemy knight might remove him from the battlefield, but to capture him alive meant potential wealth. This created a curious dynamic where soldiers were sometimes more careful to disable than to slay. The moment a knight was unhorsed and surrounded, he might cry "ransom" and offer his name and connections. By doing so, he invoked an unspoken code: he was now a source of income, not an enemy to be finished off. Captivity thus became part of the economy of war, woven into expectations of both sides. But once captured, the real work began. A prisoner's family, allies, or estate had to raise funds, and that process required intermediaries. The ransom business stretched across regions, involving clerks, messengers, merchants, and sometimes even clergy. Ransom negotiations did not happen directly between prisoner and captor in every case. Instead, brokers, men of trust, often notaries, merchants, or clerics, acted as intermediaries. They carried messages, arranged payments, and ensured promises were honored. Why were brokers needed? Because trust was fragile. A captor feared releasing a prisoner without payment. A prisoner's family feared sending money without assurance of release. Brokers guaranteed the terms. In some cities, they were officially licensed, operating almost like modern bail bondsmen. These brokers could grow wealthy. They took commissions on transactions, much as moneylenders or bankers did. In places like Italy and France, ransom brokerage became a recognized profession. Documents survive listing detailed terms, sums owed, dates of payment, and penalties for default. In effect, ransom was turned into a financial instrument. Since large sums could rarely be raised quickly, captives were often released on parole, sworn word that they would return if payment was not met. To guarantee this, pledges were made. These might include valuable objects, deeds to land, or even living hostages. It was not uncommon for a prisoner's son, brother, or companion to remain behind as collateral until full ransom arrived. This practice spread risk. If the prisoner fled without paying, his kin suffered instead. Such arrangements show how deeply intertwined ransom was with systems of honor and family obligation. Imagine a scenario: a knight captured in France is released to return to England, while his younger brother remains behind in custody. Every passing month, the family works to raise the required sum. The captive knight must return across the channel if he cannot pay, for otherwise his brother's life and freedom are forfeit. In this way, ransom extended captivity beyond one man into networks of kinship. The church, too, played a role in ransom. Clergy were often chosen as brokers, trusted for their literacy and presumed moral authority. More broadly, the church organized collections for captives, especially when Christians were held by Muslim powers after Mediterranean raids. Special funds, known as ransom chests, were maintained in some cathedrals for emergencies. Orders like the Trinitarians and Mercedarians were founded specifically to redeem captives from Islamic lands, raising money through donations and traveling preachers. Though their focus was cross-cultural captivity, their methods reflected wider ransom practices. In local conflicts, bishops sometimes mediated ransom disputes, ensuring captives were treated fairly and payments honored. Yet, even in these religious contexts, ransom remained a financial transaction. Freedom was measured in coin, not simply mercy. The sums involved in ransom could be staggering, sometimes equal to years of estate revenue. Few families could pay outright. Merchants and moneylenders stepped in, offering credit. A family might borrow against future harvests, pledge property, or agree to installment payments. This created a ripple effect in local economies. A wealthy prisoner meant business for financiers, scribes, and carriers. Debt spread outward. One man's captivity could burden entire networks. In some cases, estates collapsed under the weight of ransom debts, lands passing permanently into creditors' hands. The records of Florentine banks, for example, show loans taken out specifically for ransom. Captivity thus tied into the very growth of medieval finance, linking war and money in a system that foreshadowed modern banking. Ransom negotiations were rarely straightforward. Captors naturally sought the highest possible price, prisoners and their families argued for lower sums. The process often resembled theater, with each side exaggerating or concealing wealth. Captors might inflate a prisoner's importance, while prisoners downplayed their own status. Nobles sometimes protested that they were poor, that their lands were barren, or that their families were unable to pay. Captors might counter with threats of harsher confinement, or even gestures of generosity, reducing demands to appear magnanimous. Sometimes negotiations dragged on for years. The ransom of King John II of France, captured at Poitiers in 1356, took extensive bargaining, involving not just his family but the entire French state. The sums agreed were astronomical, reshaping national economies. On smaller scales, similar negotiations played out in countless castles, towns, and villages. For brokers, ransom was a daily business. They wrote contracts, collected pledges, witnessed oaths, and arranged safe conduct for released prisoners. They needed to be skilled in law, languages, and travel logistics. They also had to manage risk. If a prisoner defaulted, a broker's reputation suffered. If a captor reneged on terms, future deals became harder. In this sense, brokers were guardians of trust in an unsteady world. Their work underpinned the entire system, making ransom more than a gamble of honor. By the later Middle Ages, ransom had evolved into an institution as regular as taxation or tolls. It was codified in treaties, recorded in notarial registers, and normalized in warfare. The marketplace of human freedom was not an anomaly, it was part of the structure of society. Yet within this system, human lives were weighed and measured in unsettling ways. To be captured was to become an asset, a liability, a number in an account book. Brokers, creditors, and notaries handled lives as if they were contracts. For those who could pay, the system worked. For those who could not, captivity lingered, and negotiations dragged endlessly without resolution. As you consider this intricate business, the brokers, the contracts, the pledges, you may wonder, was ransom a system of protection, ensuring prisoners were spared death, or was it another form of exploitation, reducing freedom to currency? The smooth operation of ransom negotiations depended on trust, money, and time. Yet in practice, all three often broke down. Behind the contracts, brokers, and pledges, there were risks of fraud, defaults on payment, shifting politics, and the crushing human cost of delay. Captivity was a business, but it was also a gamble, and for many prisoners, the odds were stacked against them. One of the most common problems in ransom negotiations was default, failure to pay the agreed amount. A knight might return home on parole, swearing to raise funds, but find his family unable to gather enough. Merchants who loaned money might hesitate to extend further credit if they doubted repayment. Families themselves might prioritize other needs, quietly allowing a relative to languish. When payments were missed, the consequences were harsh. Captors demanded the prisoner's return, threatening punishment or the forfeiture of pledges. In some cases, guarantors or hostages suffered instead. A brother or son left behind as collateral might be subjected to harsher confinement, or even mutilation, to enforce compliance. There are records of families selling estates to pay overdue ransom debts, a process that stripped them of wealth and status. In some ways, default transformed captivity into generational debt, reshaping the fortunes of entire lineages. Fraud also haunted the ransom business. Some prisoners escaped while pretending they would return after securing funds. Others falsified documents, presenting forged receipts of payment. Captors, too, sometimes broke faith, keeping prisoners after money had been delivered. Brokers found themselves at the center of these disputes. Their reputations depended on honesty, but temptation was strong. A dishonest broker might siphon off funds or collude with one side. This is why many cities required brokers to swear oaths before civic authorities or to post bonds ensuring their integrity. Even so, fraud could ruin lives. A prisoner who believed ransom was secured might wait in vain, betrayed by intermediaries. A family who trusted a captor's promise of release might discover too late that it was hollow. In a world without centralized enforcement, justice often came too late. If it came at all, negotiations were also vulnerable to politics. A noble captured by a rival could become a pawn in larger conflicts. Treaties sometimes overrode individual agreements, delaying release until diplomatic terms were met. Prisoners found themselves caught in struggles beyond their control. During the 100 Years' War, for example, English and French captives were exchanged or held depending on the shifting tides of diplomacy. Even if a family raised ransom, the political climate might prevent payment from being accepted. In these cases, prisoners endured extended captivity while states bargained over their fate. This reveals the double-edged nature of ransom. On the one hand, it was a humanitarian custom, better than slaughter. On the other, it turned human lives into bargaining chips, subject to the cold calculations of kings and councils. For families, the process of raising ransom money could be devastating. The sums demanded for nobles often equaled years of income. Families sold land, pawned heirlooms, or borrowed heavily. In some cases, they turned to towns or guilds for support, appealing to community loyalty. This placed households in precarious positions. Estates could shrink permanently, wealth dissipating into creditors' hands. Even if ransom was eventually paid, recovery was slow, leaving families weakened for generations. For poorer prisoners, common soldiers, minor knights, the situation was worse. If their families could not pay, negotiations dragged or collapsed. The ransom business, so effective for elites, abandoned the lesser ranks. These men became forgotten captives, fading into silence. Because ransom depended on negotiation, the process often lasted years. A noble might be captured in his 20s and released in his 30s, returning to a family transformed. A widow who had remarried, children grown without him, estates shifted into other hands. These were common realities. The length of captivity deepened trauma. Prisoners waiting for resolution endured not only physical confinement but also the psychological strain of uncertainty. Would ransom ever come? Would promises be honored? In one poignant example, a knight left behind in Castile during the 14th century wrote repeated letters begging his family not to forget him. His appeals reveal the agony of suspended time, where each passing year eroded hope. Hostages, given as collateral during ransom deals, endured their own uncertain fate. They were often young sons or brothers, chosen because of their value to the prisoner's family. Their lives hung on the success of negotiations. Some hostages were treated well, integrated into households as guests. Others were kept under guard, facing harsh conditions. In the worst cases, they suffered violence when payments faltered. Their presence ensured compliance but also spread the burden of captivity beyond the initial prisoner. For hostages, captivity could last years, shaping childhoods and adulthoods. In this way, ransom became a chain that bound multiple lives across generations. Beyond finance and politics, ransom carried an emotional toll. Prisoners endured humiliation at being reduced to bargaining objects. Families faced guilt for failing to raise funds. Hostages lived with fear of punishment. Letters from captives often speak of despair, pleading for remembrance. Some expressed resignation, committing their fate to God. Others displayed bitterness, accusing kin of neglect. These voices, fragile yet preserved in archives, remind us that behind the contracts and sums were human beings grappling with pain. When negotiations failed completely, captivity became permanent. A prisoner unable to pay and with no political value could spend the rest of his life in confinement. Some were eventually absorbed into the captor's household, working as retainers or servants. Others languished in obscurity, their stories unrecorded. Failure also meant that families carried lasting scars. Estates lost, reputations diminished, and kinship ties strained. In a society that valued honor and loyalty, failure to ransom a relative could be seen as shameful, even if poverty made it unavoidable. On a broader scale, ransom shaped economies and politics. Wars became partly contests for valuable captives. States developed bureaucracies to manage payments, treaties, and exchanges. Merchants gained profits through loans and brokerage. Entire communities mobilized to redeem their members. But the system also entrenched inequality. Wealthy nobles had better chances of release, poor soldiers often vanished. The business of captivity reinforced social hierarchies, turning freedom itself into a marker of class. As you reflect on these risks and failures, one question lingers: did the ransom system truly protect human life, or did it merely shift suffering into a prolonged negotiation, spreading captivity into households, economies, and even generations? The medieval ransom system, so deeply woven into the fabric of warfare and society, did not last unchanged forever. As Europe transitioned from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period, the business of captivity shifted, declined, and in some cases disappeared. Yet its legacy lived on, in the laws of war, the practices of diplomacy, and the ways societies remembered conflict. One major factor behind the decline of ransom was the changing nature of warfare. The knightly combat of the High Middle Ages, where capture was common and valuable, gave way to mass armies, firearms, and new tactics. In battles dominated by gunpowder and infantry, individual knights were less central. Capturing a noble in plate armor was no longer the main prize. Instead, entire companies of soldiers fought, died, or deserted. Mass slaughter replaced selective capture. The Hundred Years' War had already revealed this trend, with battles like Agincourt, 1415, showing that even noble captives could be executed en masse if circumstances demanded. In later wars, especially the brutal conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries, the scale of fighting made ransom less practical. Another shift was the rise of centralized states and standing armies. When kings controlled armies directly, individual captors had less freedom to negotiate ransom for themselves. Prisoners became property of the crown, and their fate was determined by rulers, not battlefield soldiers. This bureaucratization of war transformed captivity. Ransom still occurred, but it was increasingly managed at the state level, through treaties and official exchanges, rather than through private deals. This meant less room for brokers and independent negotiators. The ransom system, once decentralized and personal, became absorbed into larger structures of diplomacy. Captivity became less about individual wealth and more about national policy. Religious and cultural changes also influenced the decline of ransom. The late medieval and early modern periods saw growing critiques of the corruption of war. The ideal of knightly combat, with its codes of ransom and chivalry, lost prestige. Reformation debates and humanist thinkers questioned the morality of turning human lives into commodities. Meanwhile, captivity across religious boundaries continued to play a role, especially in the Mediterranean, where Christian and Muslim states clashed. But even here, new systems developed. Naval warfare and piracy produced massive numbers of captives, far exceeding the capacity of traditional ransom systems. States turned to organized exchanges or mass redemptions, supported by religious orders. For ransom brokers, these changes meant decline. The profession that had once thrived in medieval towns lost ground as states centralized control. Some brokers adapted by shifting into notarial work, banking, or diplomacy. Others vanished with the fading of the ransom economy. The skills of negotiation, contract making, and trust building did not disappear, however. They were absorbed into the broader growth of finance and international law. In some ways, the brokers of ransom were precursors to the diplomats and bankers of modern Europe. Even as ransom declined, its legacy of inequality endured. The system had always favored the wealthy and powerful. Nobles, kings, and knights had better chances of release, while common soldiers were left behind. This imbalance foreshadowed later practices in war, where prisoner exchanges often prioritized officers over rank-and-file troops. The medieval ransom business reminds us that freedom was never equal. It depended on status, wealth, and connections. For many, captivity remained permanent, even as others bought their way out. Though the practical business of ransom faded, its memory lingered in culture. Ballads, chronicles, and romances told tales of noble prisoners redeemed after long captivity. Figures like Richard the Lionheart, famously held in Germany, became legends. Their stories romanticized captivity, turning it into a trial of endurance and honor. At the same time, the forgotten captives, ordinary men who never returned, faded into silence. Their names rarely appear in chronicles, except as numbers in account books. This contrast between memory and oblivion reflects the deeper inequalities of history itself. Some lives remembered, others erased. The history of ransom offers lessons for understanding how societies manage captivity today. Modern prisoner-of-war systems, codified in international law, emerged partly as responses to the problems of ransom. Instead of leaving prisoners' fates to negotiation and wealth, states agreed on standards of treatment and exchange. Yet echoes of the ransom system persist. Hostage-taking for ransom still occurs in conflicts and piracy. Families still bear the burden of captivity, raising funds or enduring uncertainty. And the broader lesson remains: captivity turns human beings into commodities, whether through medieval contracts or modern bargains. Despite its hardships, the ransom system also revealed resilience. Families who sold lands, communities that pooled funds, and prisoners who endured years of uncertainty, all displayed remarkable endurance. Their struggles remind us that behind economic systems and political calculations were individuals determined to survive and to reclaim freedom. The business of captivity was never only about money. It was about loyalty, trust, honor, and the fragile bonds that tied people together. Even when the system failed, human beings found ways to adapt, to hope, and to leave traces of their voices. As you consider the rise and fall of ransom as a business, perhaps the most haunting question is this: when human freedom is reduced to a transaction, does it protect life, or does it cheapen it?